What would you do if you were hiking Arizona's deadliest mountains and realized something was hunting you? Welcome back to Haunted Fears, where tonight we're exploring 11 bone-chilling true stories from Arizona's most isolated small towns and treacherous mountain ranges. For privacy protection, names and specific details have been altered, but these stories are 100% real experiences reported by actual survivors. From the cursed Superstition Mountains to Jerome's sealed mining tunnels, these encounters will make you question everything you thought you knew about Arizona's wilderness. Before we begin, drop your location and current time in the comments below. Let's see who's brave enough to watch alone at night. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell because you won't want to miss what happens next. What would you do if the mountain you hiked 100 times suddenly refused to let you leave? Imagine walking the same trail for hours, only to realize you've been circling the same landmark for 3 days straight, and your watch insists time is moving faster than your body can feel. My name is Brielle, and I'm telling you this story because I need you to understand something crucial about the Superstition Mountains east of Phoenix. They remember you. People around Apache Junction will warn you about the Lost Dutchman's mine, about the curse that's claimed hundreds of lives since the 1800s. But what they don't tell you is that some people who enter those mountains don't just die. Some of us get trapped in something far worse than death, and we only escape by sheer luck, or perhaps because the mountain decides to spit us back out. I'd been hiking the Superstitions every weekend for 5 years. I knew the trails like I knew my own home. The Peralta Trail, Siphon Draw, Treasure Loop. I'd walked them in summer heat that could kill you in hours, and winter cold that bit through every layer. I wasn't some tourist who showed up in flip-flops with a single water bottle. I was prepared, experienced, respectful of the mountain. That Saturday in March started like any other hike. I parked at the Lost Dutchman State Park trailhead at 6 in the morning. Signed the trail register, checked my GPS, and headed up Siphon Draw toward Flatiron. The first hour was perfect. Cool desert air, sunrise, painting the volcanic rock formations in shades of orange and red, the familiar crunch of gravel under my boots. I passed a couple of early morning hikers heading down, exchanged the usual nods and brief warnings about a steep section ahead. By 7:30, I was alone on the trail, which wasn't unusual. The Superstitions can feel empty even on busy days once you get past the casual hikers. I stopped at my usual rest point, a flat boulder with a view of Weaver's Needle in the distance, and that's when I noticed something off. The boulder had a cairn on it, a small stack of rocks, deliberately placed. I'd been to this exact spot dozens of times, and there had never been a cairn here. The trail maintenance crews actively remove them because tourists built them everywhere, thinking they were helping mark paths when really they just confuse people. I kicked it over out of habit and kept climbing. 30 minutes later, I reached what should have been the saddle before the final scramble to Flatiron Summit. Except I wasn't at the saddle. I was back at the boulder, the same flat boulder with the same view of Weaver's Needle, and the cairn was rebuilt. I stood there, staring at those stacked rocks, trying to make sense of it. Maybe I'd gotten turned around somehow, taken a wrong turn without realizing it. But Siphon Draw is a straightforward trail. You go up. There aren't really alternate paths until you're much higher. I checked my GPS. The screen showed my location as a blue dot, but the trail lines were gone. Just a blank map with my dot in the center, and nothing else. My phone had full battery and showed 2 bars of service, but when I tried to open the map app again, it froze. I'm not the panicking type, so I did what made sense. I kept hiking up, following the trail markers I could see. The metal posts with trail numbers were still there, so I followed them. I climbed for what felt like another hour, my legs burning with the familiar effort of the steep sections, my heart rate steady in that zone where you're working hard but sustainable. When I stopped for water, I checked my watch. It was 7:45. That was impossible. I'd been hiking for over an hour since seeing that cairn, but only 15 minutes had passed according to my watch. That's when the real fear set in. Not panic, but that cold, creeping understanding that something was very wrong. I turned around to head back down. Going down should have been faster. Easier on the cardio, if harder on the knees. I practically jogged the descent, eager to get back to the parking lot and figure out if I was having some kind of medical episode. Maybe the heat was getting to me even though it was a cool morning. Maybe I was more dehydrated than I thought. 20 minutes of fast downhill hiking brought me right back to the boulder. The cairn was there. But now there were two of them, two identical stacks of rocks side by side. I didn't rebuild that second cairn. I hadn't been anywhere near this spot since I'd headed down. I spun around looking for other hikers, anyone who might be messing with me, but the mountain was empty. The silence was total except for my own breathing. No bird calls, no insects, no wind. The superstitions are never that quiet. There's always something. A raven's cry, the rustle of a lizard, the whisper of air through the canyons. This was like standing in a photograph. I tried my phone again, still frozen on that blank map. I tried calling. The call failed immediately, even though I showed service bars. I sent a text to my emergency contact saying I was having GPS issues and heading back down. The message showed as sent. Hours later, I'd learn it never arrived. For the next attempt, I ignored the trail completely. I bushwhacked straight down the slope in what I knew was the direction of the parking area. The terrain was rough, full of loose rock and catclaw acacia that tore at my clothes, but I kept moving downward. Downward always leads somewhere in mountains. Follow gravity, and you'll hit a road or a drainage or something human eventually. After what felt like 2 hours of scrambling descent, I broke through some desert brush and stepped onto a trail. Not the parking lot, but a maintained trail with markers. I looked up at the signpost. Siphon Draw Trail. I looked around for landmarks, and my stomach dropped. I could see the boulder 30 feet away. Both cairns were still there. Now there was a third one. That's when I started to understand I wasn't dealing with navigation problems. Something was keeping me here. I sat down on the trail and forced myself to think logically. I had food for the day, 3 liters of water, a first aid kit, an emergency beacon, and warm layers in my pack. If I was stuck, I could survive until someone came looking for me. I pulled out my emergency beacon and activated it. The device was designed to send my GPS coordinates to search and rescue via satellite. It should have worked even if my phone didn't. The light blinked green, confirming signal sent. I decided to stay put and wait for rescue. That was the smart survival move when you're lost. Stay in one place so searchers can find you. I made myself comfortable against a rock, rationed my water, and watched the sun track across the sky. Except the sun didn't move normally. It seemed to jump in the sky, lurching from position to position like a skipping video. One moment it was morning light, then suddenly it was harsh noon sun, then late afternoon gold, all within what felt like minutes. My watch was useless, the hands spinning randomly. When darkness fell, it fell all at once, like someone flipped a switch. No twilight, no gradual dimming, just instant night. I pulled out my headlamp, and that's when I saw them. Footprints in the dust around my boulder. Lots of them, all different sizes, all circling the rock where I sat. I hadn't heard anyone approach. I'd been watching the trail. These prints just appeared in the beam of my light, pressed into the dirt like they'd always been there. I stayed awake all night, my headlamp illuminating a small circle around me while the darkness pressed in from all sides. I heard footsteps on gravel, the crunch of boots on stone, but saw nothing. Voices called my name from different directions, voices that sounded like my friends, my family, park rangers. But I didn't answer. Something in my gut told me that answering those voices would be a mistake. When dawn came, again, instant, no sunrise, I was back at the boulder, but the cairns were gone. All of them. The trail looked normal. My GPS suddenly showed the full map again, my location exactly where it should be. My watch read 6:15 a.m., the same time I'd started my hike. My phone showed no past time, no sent messages. My emergency beacon showed no activation history. It was like the entire experience had been erased, like I'd just arrived at this spot for the first time. I ran down that mountain faster than I've ever moved in my life. When I reached the parking lot, my car was there, but so were 3 others that definitely hadn't been there when I arrived. I checked the trail register. My name was signed in, but the date was 3 days later than when I'd started. I'd lost 72 hours. The ranger station had no record of my emergency beacon activation. Search and rescue had never been called. My emergency contact never received my text. According to everyone else, I'd simply been hiking, alone in the superstitions for 3 days without checking in, which wasn't unusual for experienced hikers doing multi-day trips, except I hadn't planned a multi-day trip and had no memory of 2.5 of those days. The doctors found nothing wrong with me. No head injury, no signs of heat stroke or dehydration, no drugs in my system. I was tired and dirty but otherwise healthy. My gear showed 3 days of wear. My water was empty, my food gone, my boots more scuffed than they should have been from a single morning hike. But I only remembered those hours of circling that boulder, of time moving wrong, of the mountain holding me in place. I moved away from Arizona 2 months later. I couldn't stay near those mountains knowing what I knew. But here's what terrifies me most. Sometimes I still smell that desert air, that specific scent of creosote and sun-baked rock. And when I do, I check my watch obsessively, terrified that time is skipping again, that the mountain decided it wasn't done with me after all, because I don't think I escaped the superstitions. I think they let me go, and something that lets you go once can always call you back. What would you do if you explored an abandoned mining town and every photograph you took showed dozens of people standing behind you, people you never saw with your own eyes? Imagine reviewing your camera roll and realizing that in every single shot, the crowd of ghosts is getting closer, their faces becoming clearer, their expressions more desperate. My name is Jasper, and I'm a professional photographer, specializing in abandoned locations and urban decay. I've shot everything from Detroit's empty factories to ghost towns across the Southwest, building a portfolio that's gotten me published in several photography magazines and landed me a decent social media following. I'm not easily spooked. I've spent nights alone in some genuinely creepy places, and I've never experienced anything I couldn't explain with logic and science. That confidence is what made me dismiss the warnings about the old mining settlement in the Bradshaw Mountains near Crown King, Arizona. The town doesn't have an official name anymore. Locals just call it the Old Camp when they reference it at all, which isn't often. It was a gold rush settlement from the 1880s, boomed for maybe 15 years, then died when the mine played out. Unlike Jerome or Bisbee, this place never got a second life as a tourist attraction. It just sat there in the mountains, slowly collapsing back into the earth, forgotten by everyone except occasional historians and photographers like me. I'd found references to it in mining records and got permission from the property owner to shoot there for a weekend in late April. The drive up was spectacular, winding mountain roads through high desert transitioning to pine forest. The Bradshaws rising up all around me in layers of ancient volcanic rock. I reached the site around 3 in the afternoon, giving me several hours of good light before sunset. The town was bigger than I'd expected, maybe 30 structures still standing in various states of decay. There was a main street of sorts, lined with commercial buildings, a general store, a saloon, what looked like an assay office. Behind those were residential cabins, and further up the slope, the mine entrance itself, a dark opening in the hillside surrounded by rusted equipment and collapsed wooden frameworks. I started shooting immediately, working methodically through the main street. My process is always the same: shoot wide, establishing shots first, then move in for details and textures. The light was perfect. That golden late afternoon sun that makes everything look magical. The buildings were incredible subjects. Weathered wood, gone silver gray, windows empty or filled with broken glass, doorways that opened onto nothing but collapsed floors and exposed earth. I was in my element, completely focused on composition and exposure, already imagining how these shots would look in my portfolio. I'd been shooting for maybe an hour when I noticed something odd. I was reviewing images on my camera's LCD screen, checking exposure and focus, when I saw what looked like a figure in the background of one shot. It was in the window of the saloon, just a dark shape, blurry and indistinct. I looked up at the actual building. The window was empty. I looked back at the screen. The figure was definitely there. My first thought was that it was a trick of light and shadow, maybe a piece of remaining furniture or debris that my eye had interpreted as human-shaped. It happens sometimes in photography, pareidolia, seeing faces and figures where none exist. I kept shooting, moving to the residential section. The cabins were smaller, more intimate, and somehow sadder than the commercial buildings. These were homes once, places where miners lived with their families, dreaming of striking it rich. Now they were just rotting wood and rusted nails, doorways that led nowhere. I shot a particularly striking cabin with wildflowers growing through the floorboards, a beautiful juxtaposition of nature reclaiming human construction. When I reviewed that shot, there were 3 figures visible in the cabin's doorway. A woman and 2 children, all in period clothing, all completely motionless, all staring directly at the camera. At me. I spun around to look at the actual cabin. Nothing there, just empty space and afternoon shadows. My hands started shaking as I scrolled through the previous images. Every single photograph had figures in it. Sometimes one, sometimes dozens, all in 1880s clothing, all positioned behind where I'd been standing when I took the shot. In the chronological sequence of images, they were getting progressively closer to the camera position. I'm a rational person. I don't believe in ghosts or supernatural phenomena. But I couldn't explain what I was seeing. These weren't photographic artifacts or lens flares. They were detailed, clear human figures that hadn't been visible when I took the shots. I considered equipment malfunction, maybe something wrong with the camera sensor, but that didn't explain why the figures were consistently period appropriate or why they appeared to be moving closer between frames. I decided to test it. I set up my camera on a tripod in the middle of the main street, pointed it at the general store, and took a shot while watching the actual scene carefully. Nothing visible moved. No people, no animals. Nothing but wind-stirring dust. I checked the image immediately. 15 people were visible in the frame, standing in a semicircle around where I was positioned with the camera. They were close enough that I could see their faces clearly, gaunt, hollow-eyed, expressions of desperate hunger or maybe longing. Several were reaching toward the camera with skeletal hands. That's when I should have left. Every instinct screamed at me to pack my gear and get off that mountain before sunset. But photographers are cursed with curiosity, and I had to know what was happening. I forced myself to keep shooting, documenting everything, treating it like an assignment. If this was real, if I was somehow photographing actual ghosts or some kind of temporal echo, this was the story of a lifetime. My rational mind was fighting my growing terror, and professional ambition was winning. I moved toward the mine entrance as the sun dropped toward the horizon. The mine itself was dangerous. The wooden supports were mostly collapsed. Warning signs posted by the Forest Service told people to stay out due to bad air and cave-in risk. But the area around the entrance was accessible, littered with old equipment and debris. I shot the mine opening, that black mouth in the hillside that had swallowed so many lives and fortunes. The image on my screen made my stomach drop. The mine entrance was full of people. Dozens of them, maybe over 100 packed into that opening, all facing outward, all staring at the camera with expressions of absolute anguish. Their mouths were open like they were screaming, but I heard nothing except mountain wind and my own rapid breathing. And in the foreground of the image, much closer than the others, was a man in a mine foreman's outfit, his face clear and detailed. He was pointing at me, or at the camera, and his mouth was formed around words I could almost read. Get out. I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed my tripod, camera still attached, and started back toward my truck. But something was wrong with the town now. The buildings looked different, more solid, less ruined. Smoke was rising from some of the chimneys. I could hear sounds, voices, the clang of metal on metal, a piano playing in the saloon. The sun was setting fast, shadows pooling in the spaces between buildings. And in those shadows, I saw movement. Figures, lots of them, moving through the town like it was still 1880 whatever, going about their business, living their lives. I started running. My truck was parked at the edge of town, maybe 300 yards away, but it felt like miles. The sounds grew louder, voices calling out to each other, laughter, the creak of wagon wheels. I could smell wood smoke and cooking food and something else, something chemical and acrid that made my eyes water. The buildings weren't ruins anymore. They were intact, whole, alive with activity. People walked past me on the street so close I could have touched them, but none of them seemed to see me. I was the ghost in their world, the invisible observer. I made it to my truck as the last sunlight disappeared behind the mountains. The moment I crossed whatever boundary separated the town from the surrounding forest, everything snapped back to normal. The buildings were ruins again, the sounds ceased, the smells vanished. I threw my gear in the back, jumped in the cab, and drove down that mountain road faster than was safe, not stopping until I was back in Crown King with lights, and people, and blessed, normal reality. I didn't look at the rest of the photos until I got home to Phoenix 2 days later. I'd been too shaken to review them immediately. What I found on my memory card defied explanation. Over 200 images, and every single one contained figures that hadn't been visible when I shot them. But it was the last photo that haunts me most, the one I didn't remember taking. It was a selfie, apparently shot, while the camera was hanging around my neck, pointed upward at my face. In the image, I'm surrounded by dozens of figures, all pressed close against me, their hands on my shoulders, my arms, my chest. And they're all smiling, these desperate, hungry smiles, like they'd been waiting decades for a visitor and didn't want to let me go. I developed severe anxiety after that trip. I stopped taking photography assignments involving abandoned locations. The images I shot that day are locked away on an external hard drive I never access. Too terrified to look at them again. Too terrified to delete them. Because sometimes, on my regular camera, when I'm shooting normal assignments, weddings, corporate events, family portraits, I review my images and see something in the background. Just a flicker, just a shadow, but shaped like a person in old-fashioned clothing. Like whatever I encountered in that ghost town followed me home. Like I'm not just photographing the living anymore. And I wonder, every time I raise a camera to my eye, what else I might be capturing that I can't see until it's too late. What would you do if you were leading a search and rescue mission in the mountains, and you found the missing hiker suspended 20 feet up in a tree, alive but with no memory of how they got there? Imagine discovering that every piece of their gear had been carefully arranged around them by something with strength no human possesses. My name is Chase, and I've been with the Santa Catalina Mountain Search and Rescue Team for 11 years. I've seen a lot in that time. Dehydrated hikers, broken bones, heart attacks on trails, even a few fatalities. You develop a kind of professional detachment in this job because if you let every tragedy get to you, you'll burn out in 6 months. I thought I'd seen everything the mountains could throw at us until we got the call about Marcus Hendricks last July. That rescue changed everything. I thought I understood about the wilderness around Tucson. The call came in on a Thursday afternoon. A solo hiker, 42-year-old male, experienced outdoorsman, had missed his check-in time after a day hike on the Romero Canyon Trail. His wife reported him overdue by 4 hours, which wasn't necessarily alarming, but she said it was unlike him not to call if he was running late. He had a satellite beacon and hadn't activated it, which could mean nothing, or could mean he was incapacitated and unable to reach it. We assembled a team of 6, myself as team leader, 2 other experienced SAR members named Riker and Callum, plus 3 volunteers who'd done enough missions to know the protocols. We started from the Catalina State Park trailhead just before sunset, headlamps and thermal imaging equipment ready. The Romero Canyon Trail is popular, well-maintained, not particularly dangerous if you're careful. Marcus had logged his route in the trailhead register. He'd planned to hike up to Romero Pools and back, about 6 miles round-trip, moderate difficulty. Should have taken him 4, maybe 5 hours max. We were now at hour 7 since he'd started, and the desert was cooling fast as night fell. Riker had the thermal scanner, sweeping it across the landscape as we climbed. The technology picks up heat signatures from bodies, even through brush and at considerable distance. For the first 2 miles, we got nothing but wildlife. Javelina, a few deer, the occasional coyote signature. The trail was empty of human presence. We called Marcus's name every few minutes, our voices echoing off the canyon walls. Standard procedure, though in my experience, if someone's badly injured or unconscious, they're not answering anyway. We reached Romero Pools around 9 p.m. It's a beautiful spot during the day. Natural water pools in the rock, surrounded by cottonwoods and sycamores. A little oasis in the desert mountains. At night, with just our headlamps cutting through the darkness, it felt isolated and eerie. We found Marcus's day pack almost immediately, sitting on a flat rock near the largest pool. That was our first red flag. Nobody leaves their pack behind in the wilderness. Your pack has your water, your food, your emergency supplies, your phone. You don't separate from it unless something's very wrong. Callum examined the pack while I radioed base to report that we'd found his gear. The pack was fully stocked, water bottles still full, energy bars untouched, first aid kit sealed, phone inside with half battery remaining, but no signal this deep in the canyon. His car keys were in a side pocket. Everything you'd expect to find, all perfectly organized, nothing disturbed. But no Marcus. His boots are here too, Riker called from 20 feet away. He was standing near a different section of the pools, his headlamp pointing down at a pair of hiking boots placed neatly side by side on the rock, laces still tied. Socks were tucked inside them. That was red flag number 2. People don't take off their boots in the wilderness unless they're crossing water or dealing with a blister emergency. And if it was the latter, the boots would be lying wherever they'd been removed, not placed carefully like someone was organizing their closet. We expanded our search pattern, moving in a grid around the pools area, and that's when the thermal scanner picked up a signature. "Got something," Riker said, his voice tight. 30 yards, northeast, elevated position. Elevated was weird. People who are hurt generally aren't climbing. We moved toward the signature, and what we found made absolutely no sense. Marcus was in a tree. Not at the base of a tree, not leaning against a tree. In the tree, about 20 feet up, wedged into a fork where 3 large branches met. His body was positioned almost carefully, arms at his sides, legs together, like someone had placed him there deliberately. He was unconscious but breathing, wearing only his underwear, his bare skin pale in our headlamp beams. "Marcus!" I shouted up at him. No response. "Marcus, can you hear me?" Nothing. Callum was already getting the climbing gear ready, while I radioed for helicopter extraction. There was no way we were getting an unconscious man down from that tree and then hiking him 6 miles out in the dark. We needed air support. I'm a certified climber. You have to be for mountain SAR work. So I geared up and went up after him. As I climbed closer, I could see he had no obvious injuries. No blood, no visible broken bones, no signs of a fall or attack. His skin was cool but not dangerously cold, his pulse steady when I checked it, his breathing regular. He was just out, deeply unconscious in a way that looked almost peaceful. But the weird part, the part that made my skin crawl, was how he was positioned. He wasn't tangled in the branches like someone who'd climbed up and passed out. He was arranged. His arms were straight at his sides, pressed against his body. His legs were together, feet pointing down. His head was tilted back slightly, face toward the sky. It looked like he'd been carefully placed into that fork by someone who wanted him stable and secure. I got a harness on him, and we lowered him down with ropes, the whole team working together to keep him from hitting branches or swinging into the trunk. Once we had him on the ground, our team medic, that was Callum, did a full assessment. Vitals were stable, no injuries, no signs of drug use or poisoning, no evidence of seizure or stroke. He was just unconscious, deeply so, and wouldn't wake up despite our attempts. While we waited for the helicopter, I went back to examine the tree with my headlamp. I'm 6'2", and I couldn't reach the lowest branch of that tree without jumping. There was no way Marcus had climbed up there in his underwear with no gear. The bark showed no scuff marks from climbing, no disturbed areas where hands or feet would have scrambled for purchase. And here's what really bothered me. Directly under where Marcus had been positioned, the ground was covered in his clothes, not scattered like he'd undressed while moving, but laid out in a pattern. His shirt was spread flat on the ground, arms extended. His pants were next to it, also flat, legs straight. His underwear would have been there too if he hadn't been wearing it. They formed a human shape on the ground, like a clothing outline of a body. The helicopter arrived 40 minutes later, the rotor wash scattering leaves and dust. We loaded Marcus into the rescue basket and watched him get lifted away toward Tucson Medical Center. As the helicopter's lights faded, Riker pointed his thermal scanner back at the tree where we'd found Marcus. "Chase," he said quietly, "you need to see this." I looked at the scanner's screen. There were heat signatures in the trees around us. Multiple signatures, positioned high up in the branches, all around our location in a rough circle. At least a dozen of them, each one human-sized, each one stationary and watching us from the darkness above. We swept our headlamps up into the canopy but saw nothing. Just branches and leaves and empty air where the thermal was showing us bodies. We didn't discuss it. We just packed our gear and moved down the trail faster than we'd come up, not quite running, but close to it. Professional discipline kept us together and moving in formation, but I could feel the fear radiating off my team. We all saw those signatures. We all knew there was nothing human in those trees that could position a grown man 20 feet up without leaving a trace. Marcus woke up 2 days later in the hospital. I visited him as soon as I heard, bringing the incident report for him to review. He had no memory of anything after reaching the pools. He remembered setting down his pack, remembered thinking about filtering some water, and then nothing until waking up in a hospital bed. The doctors found nothing wrong with him beyond some mild dehydration and muscle fatigue consistent with a day of hiking. But here's what the doctors didn't see, and what I couldn't put in my official report. Marcus had marks. Not injuries exactly, but impressions on his skin, like pressure marks from someone gripping him. They were on his shoulders, his upper arms, his thighs, places you'd hold someone if you were carrying them. The marks were too large to be human hands. The fingers were too long, the grip span too wide. And they were positioned wrong, like whatever held him had extra joints in its fingers, or bent in ways human hands don't. Marcus noticed me looking at the marks. "They were in the trees," he said quietly. "I remember now, just pieces. I saw them when I looked up from the water. They were watching me from the branches, and then they came down." "What came down, Marcus?" I asked, even though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. "I don't know. They moved wrong, too fast, not like people. They took my clothes off very carefully, very gently, like they were curious about them. And then they carried me up. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, just aware of being lifted. They put me in the tree like they were protecting me, storing me. I don't know. And then everything went dark. I filed my report with as much clinical detail as possible, leaving out the parts that sounded insane. But I made sure to note the thermal signatures we'd recorded, the impossible positioning of the victim, the arrangement of clothing. 3 other SAR coordinators pulled me aside after reading it. They told me about other rescues over the years. Hikers found in impossible positions, on cliff ledges they couldn't have reached, inside cave systems with no visible entry path, suspended in trees like Marcus. Always unconscious, always with no memory, always with those same strange marks on their skin. I still work SAR in the Catalinas. Someone has to. But I don't go out at night anymore unless it's absolutely critical. And when we do night rescues, I always keep my thermal scanner on, sweeping the trees above us, watching for signatures that shouldn't be there. Because whatever lives in those mountains, whatever watches us from the branches, it's still there. Still curious, still carrying people up into the trees and arranging them like specimens in a collection. And some night, it might decide that rescuing them is more interesting than just observing. Some night, it might decide to keep one of us instead. What would you do if you broke through a deliberately sealed mine tunnel and found a camp where 12 miners had barricaded themselves in, their final journal entries describing something that was hunting them in the darkness? Imagine reading their last words and realizing they chose to die trapped underground rather than let something escape to the surface. My name is Tatum, and I'm what people call an urban explorer, though I prefer the term industrial historian. I document abandoned places before they're lost to time, old factories, ghost towns, defunct infrastructure. I'm particularly drawn to mining operations because they tell stories about ambition, desperation, and the brutal reality of extracting wealth from the earth. Jerome, Arizona, is a gold mine for people like me, literally. The entire town is built into the side of Mingus Mountain, a former copper mining boomtown that produced over $1 billion worth of ore before the mines closed in the 1950s. The town survived as a tourist trap and artist colony, but the real Jerome, the dangerous, honest Jerome, exists underground in thousands of miles of mining tunnels that honeycomb the entire mountain. I'd been planning this exploration for months, getting permits where I could, researching maps from the Historical Society, talking to old-timers who remembered when the mines were operational. Most of the main tunnels were sealed or collapsed, deemed too dangerous for public access, but I'd found references to a section called the Lower Douglas that had been deliberately closed in 1927, not due to the mine playing out, but after what the records vaguely called an incident. 12 miners went into that section on a Tuesday morning and never came back out. The company sealed the tunnel from the outside within 48 hours, and there was no official investigation, no recovery of bodies, nothing. Just a brief notation in the mining logs. Lower Douglas permanently closed, do not reopen. That kind of mystery is exactly what draws me to these places. I wanted to know what happened down there, why a profitable section of mine was abandoned so abruptly, and why the company had been so determined to seal it fast. I'd located what I thought was an access point, a ventilation shaft that connected to the Lower Douglas about 300 feet below the surface. It was on the outskirts of Jerome, hidden in the scrub oak and manzanita, the metal grating over it rusted and half collapsed. Perfect. I went down on a Saturday in late October, telling my girlfriend Ariella where I'd be and when to expect me back. Standard safety protocol. Always tell someone your location and timeline. I had professional gear, climbing harness, rope, headlamp with backup batteries, respirator for bad air, gas detector for toxic fumes, first aid kit, emergency beacon, enough water and food for 12 hours. I wasn't some amateur with a flashlight and a death wish. I knew the risks and prepared for them. The descent down the ventilation shaft was straightforward. Rusty ladder bolted to the wall, still solid enough to hold my weight. The air got cooler and damper as I went down. the circle of daylight above me shrinking to a distant coin of brightness. At the bottom, the shaft opened into a horizontal tunnel, maybe 6 feet high and 4 feet wide, supported by old timber frames that looked disturbingly fragile. My gas detector showed elevated carbon dioxide, but nothing immediately dangerous. I marked my entry point with reflective tape and headed deeper. The tunnel ran straight for about 200 feet before branching into multiple passages. I followed the largest one, the one that, according to my historical maps, should lead to the lower Douglas main chamber. The walls were dark volcanic rock, rough and jagged, with occasional veins of copper ore still visible, green oxidized streaks that caught my headlamp beam. It was absolutely silent, except for my breathing and the crunch of my boots on loose rock. I'd been in dozens of mines, and they were never truly quiet. There was always water dripping somewhere, air moving through unseen passages, the occasional crack of settling rock. This was different. This was dead silence, like the mountain itself was holding its breath. I found the collapse after about 30 minutes of careful progress. It wasn't a natural cave-in. This was deliberate. Someone had used explosives to bring down the ceiling, creating a wall of broken rock that completely blocked the passage. But here's what was strange. The collapse was reinforced. Heavy timber beams had been placed against the rubble, and behind those someone had mortared stones into place, creating a permanent seal. This wasn't about preventing access due to instability. This was about making absolutely certain nothing could get through. I found red paint splashed across the sealed entrance, the kind miners used for warning markers, faded but still visible after nearly a century. I started carefully removing rocks from the top of the pile, working slowly to avoid triggering a secondary collapse. It took me almost 2 hours to create an opening large enough to squeeze through. The air that came through the gap was stale and chemical smelling, like nothing I'd encountered in other mines. My gas detector started registering compounds it couldn't identify, which was concerning but not immediately dangerous according to the readout. The tunnel on the other side was different. The rock was darker, almost black, and covered in a fine dust that rose in clouds when I disturbed it. The timber supports here were ancient, visibly rotting, some of them collapsed entirely, and there were tools scattered on the ground, pickaxes, shovels, lanterns, all from the 1920s era, all left where they'd fallen. My headlamp caught something else, clothing, a work shirt, stiff with age and covered in that black dust, boots, a hat, all arranged in rough human shapes on the tunnel. Floor, like the people wearing them, had simply evaporated and left their clothes behind. I counted 5 separate piles of clothing as I moved deeper. 5 miners, their outfits preserved in the dry underground air, positioned at intervals along the tunnel, like they'd been running and dropped one by one. None of them had made it back to the sealed entrance. The walls here showed damage I couldn't explain, deep gouges in the rock, as if something with immense strength had clawed at the stone. The gouges were too large and too deep to be made with mining tools. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber, and that's where I found the camp. The remaining miners, 7 of them based on the supplies, had barricaded themselves in this space. They'd used ore carts to block the tunnel entrance, piled equipment and timber into makeshift walls, and created what looked like a desperate last stand. There were picks and axes arranged within easy reach, positioned like weapons. Empty water canisters, food tins from brands that didn't exist anymore, lanterns burned down to nothing. And there were journals, multiple notebooks, the kind with oilcloth covers that miners used to keep records, scattered around the camp. I picked up the first one with trembling hands and opened it to the first page. The handwriting was neat, professional, dated March 14th, 1927. We've opened a new vein deeper than the main shaft. The ore here is rich, but the rock formation is unusual. It's warmer than it should be at this depth, and the men are complaining about sounds, vibrations they can feel through their boots. Foreman says to keep working. The company wants results. I flipped through the entries rapidly, watching the tone change from professional optimism to growing concern. March 17th. Michael broke through into a cavity today. Natural formation, spherical, about 30 feet across. The walls are smooth, almost polished, not natural erosion. Something made this space. We should report it, but Foreman wants to check for ore deposits first. March 19th. The cavity is empty except for the smell. Chemical, acrid like burnt copper. Temperature inside is at least 20 degrees warmer than the tunnel. We're hearing the sounds constantly now, like breathing, deep underground. The men are spooked. March 21st. Something came out of the cavity last night during the graveyard shift. We didn't see it clearly. The lanterns went out all at once, every single one, like something sucked the flame right out of them. When we got them relit, Thomas was gone. We found his clothes in the tunnel. Just his clothes, still warm, arranged like he'd stepped out of them. The foreman has requested backup from the surface. March 23rd. No backup coming. Company says we're experiencing mass hysteria, probably bad air. They're threatening to dock our pay if we abandon the site. We've sealed the cavity with timber and rock. It won't stay sealed. We can hear it moving behind the barrier, testing it. March 25. It's in the tunnels with us. We've seen it now, not clearly, but enough. It doesn't have a fixed form. It flows through the rock itself, like the stone is liquid around it. It took Michael today, pulled him backwards through solid wall while we watched. He didn't even have time to scream. The handwriting was getting shakier, less controlled. March 27th. Only 7 of us left. We've barricaded ourselves in the secondary chamber. It can't seem to enter this space. Maybe the ore composition is different here. Maybe it's just toying with us. We sent Jenkins to the surface for help. He didn't make it. We found his clothes 2 hours later in the tunnel we just watched him walk through. March 29th. The company sealed the main entrance. We heard the explosives, felt the collapse. They've trapped us in here with it. We understand now. They'd rather bury us all than risk it reaching the surface. Maybe they're right. The final entry was dated April 2nd, 1927, written in barely legible scrawl. No food left, water gone. It's in the walls around us now. We can see shapes moving through the stone like shadows in ice. It's learning. It's watching us, studying how we move, how we think. When we die, it will wear us. It will put on our shapes like we put on our clothes. We're going to collapse the tunnel behind our barricade. If anyone ever finds this, understand. We chose to die here to keep it contained. Don't dig any deeper. Don't let it out. God forgive us for what we found. I stood there, in that abandoned camp, my headlamp beam cutting through decades of accumulated dust, holding a dead man's journal, and finally understanding the full horror of what had happened. These men had been sealed in alive by their own company, left to starve in the darkness because the alternative, letting something escape to the surface, was worse. My gas detector started beeping insistently. Not toxic gases, but that same unknown compound reading, and the levels were climbing. The air felt thicker suddenly, harder to breathe even through my respirator. And then I heard it. A sound like stone grinding against stone coming from deeper in the chamber, from passages that led further into the mountain. The walls started changing. The black rock seemed to shimmer and flow, and within it I saw shapes beginning to form. Human-shaped, but not quite right, like someone who'd learned to mimic human form from descriptions, but had never actually seen a person. They were made of the rock itself, flowing up out of the stone floor, and they were reaching toward me with arms that had too many joints. I dropped the journal and ran. Behind me, I heard the sound of the barricade collapsing, ore carts overturning, timber snapping. The thing that had killed those miners was no longer confined to the deep sections. Breaking through the seal had let it expand its territory, and now it was following me back toward the surface. I ran through those tunnels in blind panic, my headlamp bouncing. wildly, showing me glimpses of walls that rippled and bulged as something massive moved parallel to me through the solid rock. The piles of clothing I'd passed on the way in were different now. Some of them were standing up, animated by something that had learned to puppeteer abandoned garments, empty sleeves reaching toward me as I sprinted past. I threw myself through the opening in the collapse, sharp rocks tearing at my skin, and started hauling boulders back into place with strength born of pure terror. Behind me, something hit the barrier from the other side, not with the force of an impact, but with the pressure of immense weight, like the entire mountain was pressing against that pile of rubble. I didn't stop to see if it would hold. I climbed back through those access tunnels, following my reflective markers, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The ventilation shaft seemed impossibly far away, and twice I had to stop and check my tape because the tunnels seemed different, rearranged, like the mine itself was trying to confuse me. When I finally reached the ladder and hauled myself up into daylight, the sun was setting. I'd been underground for 9 hours. I collapsed in the brush, my whole body shaking, and that's when I felt it. A vibration through the ground, subtle but unmistakable. Something moving deep below, something that had followed me to the very edge of its range and was testing the boundaries of where rock ended and open air began. I reported everything to the Jerome Historical Society, to the Forest Service, to anyone who would listen. I showed them the photos I'd taken of the journals before I ran. Most dismissed it as an elaborate hoax, but the Forest Service sent someone to check the ventilation shaft. They found it collapsed, completely sealed, and they claimed it looked like it had been that way for years. But my clothes still carry that black dust that doesn't match any known mineral. My camera still has those photos of journal entries describing something that hunts through solid stone. Jerome still sits on that mountainside, tourists strolling its streets, completely unaware of what waits in the tunnels below. I think about those 12 miners who sacrificed themselves, who chose slow death by starvation to keep something contained. And I wonder if I undid their sacrifice, if breaking that seal, even briefly, gave the entity enough space to expand, to grow stronger, to begin working its way toward the surface. I don't explore mines anymore. The journals I've photographed haunt me more than any ghost could, because those men knew they were going to die, knew nobody was coming to save them, and they spent their final days not trying to escape, but trying to protect the rest of us from what they'd found. And now I carry the terrible knowledge that somewhere under Jerome, in miles of dark tunnels, something waits that has had nearly a century to learn, to adapt, to plan. Something that knows the shape of human beings, because it wore the shapes of 12 men who died trying to contain it. Something that's been waiting patiently in the darkness for someone stupid enough to break the seal. Someone like me. Have you ever wondered what it would be like to evacuate from a wildfire, only to realize the people leading you to safety aren't casting shadows in the firelight? Picture following a group of hikers through smoke and flames, watching their footprints in the ash walk backward from the direction they're heading. My name is Everly, and I'm a wildland firefighter with the Arizona Department of Forestry. I've been fighting fires in the Mazatzal Mountains for 7 years, seen burns that consumed thousands of acres, watched entire forests turn to ash in hours. You develop a respect for fire when you work this job. Not fear exactly, but a deep understanding that fire is a living thing with its own logic, its own hunger. What happened during the Backbone Fire last August taught me that some things are more dangerous than flames, and some people who appear in wildfires aren't people at all. The Backbone Fire started on a Wednesday afternoon in the peak of Arizona's dry season. Lightning strike in the Mazatzals northeast of Payson, and within 6 hours we had a monster on our hands. 15,000 acres and growing, pushed by erratic winds that made the fire behave unpredictably. My crew was assigned to the western flank, establishing fire breaks and evacuating scattered cabins and campgrounds before the main burn front reached them. It was brutal work in 100-degree heat with smoke so thick our respirators could barely filter it. By day 3, we'd evacuated maybe 30 people from remote cabins and gotten them safely down the mountain. The fire was spreading faster than our models predicted, jumping fire breaks we'd spent hours cutting. Command was talking about pulling back and letting it burn itself out in the high country where there was nothing left to save. But we'd gotten reports of possible hikers still in the burn zone, a group of 4 who'd been registered at a trailhead a week ago and hadn't checked back out. Missing hiker reports during active fires are every firefighter's nightmare because we have to balance saving lives against risking our own in conditions that can turn deadly in seconds. My crew chief, a veteran named Genevieve, assembled a team of 5, including me, to do a final sweep of the Barnhart Trail area before we pulled back. We had maybe 3 hours before the main fire front reached that zone. 3 hours to locate possible victims, get them out, and extract ourselves before we were trapped. We loaded into our truck with full gear and headed up the access road into smoke so thick our headlights barely penetrated 10 feet ahead. We found the group at the Barnhart Trailhead parking lot around 4 p.m. 4 hikers, 2 men and 2 women, all wearing appropriate gear, all looking remarkably calm given that the forest around them was actively burning. One of the women waved as we pulled up, like she'd been expecting us. That should have been my first warning that something was wrong, but in the chaos and smoke, I just felt relieved we'd found them alive. Genevieve jumped out and started coordinating. "You folks need to come with us right now. The fire's moving faster than predicted, and this area is going to be overrun within the hour." The hikers nodded, gathered their packs, and climbed into the back of our truck without argument, without questions, without the panic you'd expect from people who'd been trapped in a wildfire zone for days. We started back down the access road, but within 10 minutes it was clear we had a problem. The fire had jumped the road behind us somehow, cutting off our exit route. Flames were visible on both sides now, and the wind was shifting, pushing the fire directly toward us. Genevieve made the call to abandon the truck and hike out on foot through a drainage that should still be clear. It would be a hard 2-hour hike down rough terrain, but it was our only option. We moved fast, the 4 hikers keeping pace easily. Too easily for people who should have been exhausted and dehydrated after days in the wilderness. I was bringing up the rear, making sure nobody fell behind, and that's when I started noticing things that didn't add up. The woman who'd waved at us, her pack wasn't dirty. After supposedly a week in the backcountry during a wildfire, it looked brand new. None of them were coughing despite the smoke, and their boots, as I watched them walk ahead of me, their footprints in the ash-covered ground were wrong. The treads were facing backward, like they were walking in reverse even though they were clearly moving forward. I radioed to Genevieve at the front of the line. "Chief, something's off about these hikers. Their tracks are—" Static cut me off. Our radios were failing, which sometimes happened in heavy fire conditions, but the timing made my skin crawl. I looked at the hiker directly in front of me, a tall man with a beard, and called out, "Hey, how are you folks holding up?" He turned to look at me, and in the orange glow of the fire surrounding us, I saw that he cast no shadow. The flames were backlighting him, but no shadow fell on the ground. None of the 4 hikers had shadows. I stopped walking. My training was screaming at me to keep moving, to get out of the burn zone, but every instinct said following these people was wrong. Genevieve and the rest of my crew were ahead, still following the hikers down into the drainage. I shouted, "Chief, stop! Don't follow them!" But my voice was swallowed by the roar of the fire and the wind. The hikers turned around to face me then, all 4 of them moving in perfect synchronization. The woman who'd waved spoke, and her voice carried clearly despite the noise. "You should come with us, Everleigh. It's safer where we're going. The fire can't hurt you there." She knew my name. I'd never introduced myself. And as I watched, their forms started to flicker like heat mirages, becoming less solid, more transparent, and through their bodies I could see flames. I turned and ran, back up the drainage, away from them, away from my crew, who I could still hear ahead, calling back to me. I ran toward the fire instead of away from it because I understood with sudden terrible clarity that wherever those things were leading us wasn't safety. It was something worse than burning. I could hear footsteps behind me, multiple sets, and voices calling my name in perfect harmony. "Everley, come back. Your crew is with us. Don't you want to stay with your crew?" I found an outcropping of rock with a small cave underneath, barely big enough for one person, and I wedged myself into it. Wildland firefighter training includes fire shelter deployment as a last resort. You wrap yourself in an illuminized shelter and pray the burnover passes quickly. I deployed mine in that tiny space, covering myself completely, and felt the fire front hit maybe 30 seconds later. The heat was incredible even through the shelter. The roar deafening. The air so hot each breath scared my lungs, despite the respirator. It lasted maybe 10 minutes, though it felt like hours. When the main front passed, and I risked looking out, the forest around me was transformed into a blackened hellscape. Every tree, a charred skeleton, the ground still glowing with embers. I was alive, impossibly, sheltered by rock and luck. I radioed for extraction, and this time it worked. I gave my coordinates and waited. The helicopter found me 2 hours later. When they pulled me up, the pilot asked where the rest of my crew was. I told them about the hikers, about following them into the drainage, about the shadows, and the backward footprints. They searched for 3 days after the fire was contained. They found our truck, burned to a metal skeleton. They found the trailhead, where the hikers had been waiting, and in a collapsed drainage about a mile from where I'd sheltered, they found equipment. Fire gear, packs, tools, all belonging to my crew, but no bodies. Just gear arranged in neat rows, like someone had carefully laid it out for inspection. The official report listed my 4 crew members as missing, presumed dead in the burnover. But search dogs showed no interest in the drainage where their gear was found. No human remains were ever recovered. And when they checked the trailhead registry, there was no record of 4 hikers checking in the week before. The signatures I'd seen in the log, when they showed me photos of it, weren't there. The page for that week was blank. I don't fight wildfires anymore. I transferred to office work, training new recruits on fire behavior and safety protocols. But I tell them things that aren't in any manual. I tell them that if they encounter people during evacuations who seem too calm, too helpful, who lead you away from established routes, don't follow. I tell them to check for shadows, to watch footprints, to trust their instincts when something feels wrong, even if they can't explain why. Because fires in the Mazatzals have been claiming lives for over a century, and not all of those people actually died. Some of them are still out there, walking through the flames unburned, appearing during wildfires to lost and desperate people, offering to lead them to safety. And where they lead you isn't death by burning. It's somewhere else, somewhere the search dogs can't track, somewhere you leave your gear behind, arranged in perfect rows like you're never coming back to use it. Somewhere 4 members of my crew went when they followed those figures into the smoke, and wherever it is, I think they're still there, waiting for the next fire season, ready to help lead the next group of victims to that place, between the flames, where shadows don't exist and footprints walk backward into nothing. The Border Patrol agent's thermal camera picked up 5 heat signatures, crossing the Huachuca Mountains at 2 a.m. But when he reached their location, all he found were claw marks on the rocks, claw marks that were still warm to the touch. His radio crackled with distress calls from officers who disappeared 6 months ago, their voices begging for extraction from coordinates that led to empty desert. My name is Raphael, and I've been a U.S. Border Patrol agent for 9 years, working the rugged terrain of the Huachuca Mountains in southeastern Arizona near the Mexico border. This job isn't what most people think. It's not just about immigration enforcement. Out here in the remote canyons and valleys, you see things that don't make it into official reports. You find evidence of human trafficking, drug smuggling, people who died of dehydration trying to cross hostile terrain. But sometimes you find things that can't be explained by criminal activity or natural causes. Things that make you question whether humans are the only intelligent things moving through these mountains at night. It started in March with the radio calls. I was on night patrol, driving a remote section of the border road about 15 miles from the nearest town, when my radio crackled to life. "This is Agent Javier Martinez, badge number 467A2, requesting immediate extraction. We're pinned down in Ramsey Canyon, under attack, need backup now." The voice was panicked, desperate, real. I grabbed my radio and responded, "Martinez, this is Agent Rafael Vega. What's your location?" Static. I tried again. Nothing. I radioed dispatch to confirm Martinez's status and location. The response made my blood run cold. "Agent Martinez, badge 4782, was killed in action 6 months ago during a pursuit in the Huachucas. You're hearing things, Vega. Probably radio interference from the military base." But I knew what I'd heard. That was a live transmission. A man in distress, not some recording or interference. Over the next 2 weeks, 3 more agents reported similar radio calls. Always at night. Always from agents who were officially listed as dead or missing. Always requesting extraction from specific locations in the mountains. Command dismissed it as stress, equipment malfunction, maybe even a sick prank by someone with stolen radio equipment. But we all heard the fear in those voices. Those weren't pranks. Then the thermal camera incident started. My patrol sector included a high-tech surveillance system, cameras with thermal imaging that could detect body heat from over a mile away. The system was designed to catch crossers, trying to slip through at night when visual surveillance was impossible. On a Tuesday night in late March, my sector's cameras picked up a group of 5 heat signatures, moving through a canyon known for illegal crossing activity. I radioed it in and drove to intercept, following protocol. When I reached the canyon 20 minutes later, there was nothing. No people. No tracks in the soft dirt, nothing. But there were marks on the rocks. Deep gouges carved into the stone, running parallel like something with massive claws had scraped down the canyon wall. I put my hand near one of the gouges and pulled back immediately. The rock was hot. Not sun-warmed, but actually hot, like something with high body temperature had just touched it. This was at 2 in the morning. Nothing should have been that warm. I documented everything with my body camera and called in for a tracking team with dogs. The dogs arrived at dawn and refused to enter the canyon. They barked, pulled against their leads, showed every sign of fear. The handler, a veteran with 15 years' experience, said he'd never seen his dogs react that way. "Whatever was here, they want nothing to do with it," he told me. The pattern continued. Thermal cameras would pick up groups of 5 to 8 heat signatures, always in remote areas, always moving with coordinated precision that suggested organized crossing attempts. But when we responded, we found only those claw marks, always fresh, always warm. Sometimes we found other things. Clothing torn to shreds, backpacks with supplies untouched but arranged in circles, water bottles drained and crushed with force that bent the plastic into impossible shapes. Command's official position was that we were dealing with a sophisticated smuggling operation that had somehow figured out how to spoof our thermal cameras and evade detection. But that didn't explain the claw marks, the heat in the rocks, or the radio calls from dead agents. It definitely didn't explain what I saw in April. I was on patrol alone, monitoring a remote section near Miller Peak, when my thermal display lit up with multiple signatures, 8 of them, moving in formation through rough terrain at a speed that seemed impossible for humans carrying gear. I drove to intercept, calling for backup, but the nearest unit was 30 minutes away. By the time I reached the location, they were gone. But I found a camp. It wasn't like the migrant camps we usually encountered. Desperate people leaving behind trash and supplies as they moved quickly through hostile territory. This was deliberate. A circle of stones arranged in a perfect geometric pattern, 20 feet across. Inside the circle were items: a border patrol radio, a badge belonging to Agent Martinez, a boot that matched the description of gear worn by Agent Chen, who'd gone missing 4 months ago, and a knife with a handle carved from bone that looked ancient, definitely not modern manufacturing. I photographed everything and called it in. As I was documenting the scene, my thermal camera picked up movement on the ridge above me. I looked up and saw them, silhouettes against the stars, 8 figures standing motionless on the ridgeline. Through my night vision scope, I could see they were bipedal, roughly human-sized, but their proportions were wrong. Arms too long, heads too large, movements too fluid when they finally shifted position. I called out in English and Spanish, identifying myself as law enforcement. They didn't respond. They just watched. Then, in perfect unison, they dropped to all fours and moved down the ridge toward me with terrifying speed. Not running, flowing, like liquid over the rocks. I got back in my vehicle and locked the doors, which felt absurd but instinctive. They circled the truck 3 times and I could hear them breathing, deep, raspy breaths that sounded like air moving through a throat not designed for it. My radio crackled. "Raphael, get out of there. They're testing you. If you run, they'll chase. If you stay calm, they might leave." It was Agent Martinez's voice again, clear and close, like he was sitting next to me. "Martinez," I whispered. "We're not gone, Raphael. We're changed. The mountains took us, and now we're part of what watches the border. Warn the others. Tell them not to pursue the thermal signatures alone. Tell them—" The transmission cut to static. The figures stopped circling. One of them pressed against my driver's side window, and in the reflection of my dashboard lights, I saw its face. It had been human once. I could see the remnants of human features beneath something else, something that had grown over or through the original form. Eyes too large, mouth too wide, skin that seemed to shift between flesh and something scaled or plated. It looked at me with intelligence, with recognition, and then it spoke in a voice that sounded like words being pulled through gravel. "Go. Not your night to join us." They left, all 8 of them moving back up the ridge and disappearing over the crest. I sat in my truck until dawn, too terrified to move. When backup finally arrived, they found me there, still locked inside, and the only evidence that anything had happened was my body camera footage and the circle of stones. Except the items inside the circle were gone. The radio, the badge, the boot, the knife, all of it vanished. Command placed me on administrative leave for psychological evaluation. They said the stress of the job had gotten to me, that I'd experienced a panic attack and hallucinated the encounter. But 3 other agents came forward privately and said they'd seen similar things. We started calling them Los Transformados, the transformed ones. Agents who'd gone missing in the Huachucas and came back as something else, something that now patrolled the mountains with an intelligence and purpose we couldn't understand. I'm back on duty now, but I don't patrol alone anymore, and I don't respond to thermal signatures in the deep canyons at night. The radio calls continue. Agents who are officially dead requesting extraction, warning us about areas to avoid, sometimes just screaming in languages that aren't Spanish or English. The thermal cameras still pick up those coordinated groups moving through the mountains with impossible speed. And sometimes, on clear nights when I'm watching the border from a safe distance, I see them on the ridgelines, standing watch, guarding something, or maybe hunting something. I don't know if they're protecting the border or claiming territory, or serving some purpose that has nothing to do with human laws and boundaries. I just know that not everyone who goes missing in the Huachucas is dead. Some of them are still out there, changed into something that moves through the mountains like it owns them, something that remembers being human but isn't anymore. And whatever took them, whatever changed them, is still hungry for more. You know that feeling when you're hiking with friends, and one of them starts acting strange, saying things they'd never say, moving in ways that don't match their personality. Imagine realizing that the person walking beside you isn't your friend anymore, that something else is wearing their face, and the real version is still out there somewhere, screaming for help you can't hear. My name is Oakley, and I'm a wilderness therapy counselor working with troubled teens through an organization called Pathways Recovery. We take groups of 6 teenagers into the Arizona backcountry for 2-week intensive programs. No phones, no technology, just nature, physical challenges, group therapy, and survival skills training. The idea is that removing kids from their toxic environments and forcing them to work together in wilderness situations helps break negative patterns and build healthier coping mechanisms. I've been doing this work for 4 years, led maybe 30 expeditions, and I've seen real transformations happen. But what happened during our September trip into the Chiricahua Mountains changed everything. I thought I understood about my job, about the wilderness, and about what can happen when you take vulnerable people into isolated places. Our group consisted of 6 teens, 4 boys and 2 girls, ages 15 to 17, all dealing with various issues from substance abuse to behavioral problems to trauma. My co-counselor was a guy named Leon, experienced and solid, someone I'd worked with on a dozen previous trips. We started from the Rustler Park trailhead in the Chiricahuas on a Monday morning, packs loaded with 2 weeks of supplies, heading into the high country where we'd do a circuit through some of the most spectacular and isolated terrain in southern Arizona. The first 3 days went perfectly. The kids were adapting well, engaging in the therapy sessions, learning to work together on camp tasks and navigation challenges. We hiked through forests of ponderosa and Apache pine, camped near streams, saw wildlife. By day 4, the group dynamics were solidifying. The kids were bonding, opening up in ways their intake file suggested would take much longer. On day 5, we were hiking a remote section near Sentinel Peak when one of the girls, a 17-year-old named Celeste, complained of feeling dizzy and disoriented. Not unusual at 8,000 feet elevation, especially for kids from Phoenix who weren't accustomed to altitude. Leon and I had her sit down, drink water, eat some trail mix. She seemed to recover after 15 minutes, said she felt fine, and we continued hiking. But Celeste wasn't fine. Over the next few hours, I started noticing things that were off. Her hiking rhythm was different. Too smooth, too efficient for a teenager who'd been struggling with the physical demands just days earlier. She wasn't complaining about her pack weight, which she'd been vocal about since day 1. And her interactions with the other kids changed. She was asking them strange questions, personal things about their lives that she should have already known from days of constant proximity. That night at camp, Leon pulled me aside. "Something's wrong with Celeste," he said quietly. "She asked me what my name was. We've been hiking together for 5 days, and she asked me my name like we'd just met." I'd noticed the same thing. When I'd tried to reference a conversation we'd had 2 days earlier, she looked at me with complete confusion, like she had no memory of it. We decided to monitor her closely but not panic the other kids. Maybe it was a medication interaction, though we'd checked all prescriptions carefully during intake. Maybe altitude sickness was affecting her memory. We'd evaluate in the morning and potentially call for emergency evacuation if her condition didn't improve. I woke up around 2 a.m. to use the bathroom and did a routine check of the sleeping teens. 5 sleeping bags with lumps in them. But we had 6 kids. I counted again. Definitely only 5. I checked Leon's tent. He was there, sleeping soundly. I quietly checked each sleeping bag. Celeste's was empty, carefully arranged to look occupied. I woke Leon and we searched the immediate area with headlamps, calling her name softly so as not to wake the other kids. We found her about 50 yards from camp, standing motionless in the trees, facing away from us. "Celeste," I called. She didn't turn around. We approached carefully. "Celeste, you okay?" She turned, and her movement was wrong. Too smooth, like she was on a turntable instead of pivoting on her feet. Her face was blank, eyes reflecting our headlamp beams like an animal's. "I found her," she said in Celeste's voice, but with an odd flatness. "The real one. She's still here. Do you want to see her?" Before we could respond, we heard it. A scream from back at the camp. We ran back to find the other kids awake and terrified, pointing into the trees. There was Celeste, the real Celeste, stumbling into the firelight, her clothes torn, face scratched, hyperventilating. "Something took my face," she gasped. "I saw it put on my face and walk into camp. I've been following you all day. I've been trying to get your attention, but you couldn't see me, couldn't hear me. Please tell me you can see me now." Leon and I spun around. The other Celeste, the one we'd just been talking to in the trees, was gone. Real Celeste collapsed, and we spent the next hour calming her and the other terrified teenagers while trying to make sense of what had happened. She described waking up on day 5 after her dizzy spell to find herself separated from the group, invisible and inaudible to us, even though she was walking right beside us screaming for help. She'd watched something that looked exactly like her integrate into the group, taking her place while she was trapped in some parallel version of the hike where she could see us but we couldn't perceive her. We made the decision to evacuate immediately, even though it meant a dangerous night hike. But as we packed up camp, I realized we had a problem. I counted the kids. 7. We should have had 6. I counted again. Definitely 7 teenagers standing in the firelight. One of them wasn't real, was something else wearing a stolen face, and I had no idea which one. I pulled Leon aside and we did a roll call, asking each kid specific personal questions that only they would know from their intake files and therapy sessions. 6 of them answered correctly with appropriate emotional responses and personal details. The 7th, a boy named Diego, answered every question perfectly, but with that same flat effect we'd heard from fake Celeste. His responses were factually correct, but emotionally hollow, like he was reading from a script. Diego smiled when he realized we'd identified him. "You're learning," he said, "but you're too slow. I've already made 3 more." Before we could react, he ran into the darkness, moving with impossible speed. I counted again. 9 kids now, when we should have had 6. The copies were multiplying, and they were getting better at mimicking behavior. Over the next hour of chaos, we tried to separate real from fake, but it became impossible. They all knew personal details now, all showed appropriate emotions, all moved and spoke like themselves. The only difference was subtle. The copies would occasionally glitch, say something that was factually accurate but contextually wrong, or move in ways that were just slightly too fluid. Real Celeste was the only one we were absolutely certain about because we'd seen her displaced. We huddled with her and Leon trying to figure out which of the other 8 figures claiming to be our kids were real. And that's when we heard the voices, our own voices calling from the darkness. "Oakley, Leon, we need help out here. We got the real kids. Those ones with you are the copies." I saw myself walk into the firelight. Not a hallucination, a perfect physical copy, wearing my exact clothes, carrying my pack, speaking with my voice. "Don't listen to them," my copy said, pointing at me. "That's what it wants you to think. I'm the real Oakley. Check our credentials." For 2 hours, we existed in complete chaos, multiple versions of each person, all claiming to be real, all with perfect memories and appropriate emotional responses. The only way we could track who was by staying in constant physical contact, holding hands like children, so we knew who we'd been touching the entire time. As dawn broke, the copies began to fade, not disappearing but retreating into the trees, their forms becoming less solid, more transparent. By full sunrise, only the real 7 of us remained: Leon, me, and 5 teenagers. One of our original 6, Diego, was missing. We never found him. Search and rescue teams spent days combing the Chiricahuas and found no trace. The official report listed Diego as a runaway, assumed he'd fled the program and made his way to a road. But I know the truth. Something in those mountains can steal your form, your memories, your identity, and replace you so perfectly that even people who know you intimately can't tell the difference. And whatever it is, it kept Diego. Maybe as payment, maybe as a template, maybe for reasons we can't understand. I don't work wilderness therapy anymore. I can't take kids into isolated places knowing what I know. Sometimes I see people on the street who move just slightly wrong, whose emotional responses are factually correct but spiritually empty, and I wonder if they're real or if they're copies that made it out of the mountains and integrated into civilization. And sometimes, late at night, I get calls from my own phone number, and when I answer, I hear my own voice describing my day with perfect accuracy, telling me details about my life that only I should know, reminding me that somewhere out there is a version of me that's slightly too smooth, slightly too perfect, waiting patiently to take my place completely. I never believed my grandmother's stories about the old Spanish mission ruins in the Santa Cruz Valley until I spent 3 nights there, documenting them for my archaeology thesis, and realized the prayers I kept hearing weren't coming from any living person. The walls remember everything, every prayer, every scream, every soul that died within them, and they've been waiting centuries for someone to listen. My name is Kaya, and I'm a graduate student in Southwest Archaeology at the University of Arizona. My thesis focuses on Spanish colonial missions in southern Arizona, specifically the lesser-known sites that have been largely abandoned and forgotten by modern historians. Most mission research concentrates on the famous ones like San Xavier del Bac, but I'm interested in the failures, the missions that were established and then mysteriously abandoned, the ones that don't appear in official church records after a certain date, the ones local communities avoid talking about. That's what brought me to the ruins of Mission Santa Maria de las Lágrimas, St. Mary of the Tears, in late November. The site isn't on any tourist maps, barely mentioned in historical documents, accessible only by a rough dirt road that winds through mesquite and creosote bush about 40 miles south of Tucson. Even the locals in the nearest town of Tubac were reluctant to give me directions, and when they finally did, they warned me not to stay after dark. "That place is wrong," an elderly woman told me at a gas station. "It was wrong when the Spanish built it, wrong when they abandoned it, still wrong now. The prayers there don't go up to heaven. They go down." I dismissed her warning as local superstition mixed with anti-colonial sentiment. I'm a scientist, trained to look at physical evidence and documented history, not folklore. I had permits from the university, camping gear, cameras, measurement tools, and a detailed research plan. I'd be spending 3 days and nights at the site, documenting the remaining architecture, taking soil samples, mapping the layout, and photographing artifacts. Standard fieldwork, nothing I hadn't done at a dozen other sites. I arrived at the mission ruins around 2 p.m. on a Tuesday. The site was more substantial than I'd expected. Most of the church walls were still standing, reaching maybe 15 feet high in places, made of sun-dried adobe bricks that had somehow survived almost 300 years of monsoons and desert heat. The roof was long gone, leaving the interior open to the sky, but you could still see the basic layout: a main chapel area, side rooms that would have been living quarters for the priests, a walled courtyard, and beyond that, what looked like the remains of a small cemetery with scattered wooden crosses marking graves. The place was utterly silent. No birds, no insects, no wind, just complete absence of sound that felt unnatural in the desert, where there's always something moving, something alive. I set up my camp in the courtyard, documented my arrival time and weather conditions in my field journal, and began the systematic survey I'd planned. The architecture was fascinating. The mission showed clear signs of hasty construction and then sudden abandonment. Tools were still embedded in partially finished walls, as if workers had simply dropped them and walked away mid-project. The chapel walls were covered in religious frescoes that had faded but were still partially visible, standard Catholic iconography of saints and biblical scenes, but darker than typical mission art. Lots of images of suffering, martyrdom, souls in torment. Not the hopeful resurrection imagery you usually see in churches meant to convert indigenous populations. As the sun started setting around 5 p.m., I noticed something odd about the shadows. The walls cast shadows in directions that didn't match the sun's position. I'm not talking about slight angles being off. I mean shadows falling opposite to where they should be, like the walls were being lit by a light source that didn't exist. I documented it with photos, thinking it might be some kind of optical illusion created by the Adobe's reflective properties. I made dinner over my camp stove, reviewed my notes, and settled in for the night. The temperature dropped quickly after sunset, typical for high desert in November, and I was grateful for my cold weather sleeping bag. I was reviewing photos on my camera around 8 p.m. when I heard it for the first time. Singing. Choral singing, faint and distant, coming from the direction of the chapel. Latin words I didn't fully understand. Multiple voices in harmony. The kind of liturgical music you'd hear in a Catholic service. I grabbed my flashlight and camera and walked to the chapel entrance. The singing stopped the moment I crossed the threshold. I called out, "Hello? Is someone here?" My voice echoed off the adobe walls, but there was no response, no sound of movement, no evidence of other people. I searched the entire mission complex with my flashlight. Nobody there. Just me and the ruins, and that oppressive silence. I went back to my camp, wrote off the singing as acoustic phenomenon, maybe wind moving through the walls in a way that created sound, maybe my tired brain misinterpreting natural noises. But it happened again around midnight. The singing, clearer this time, multiple voices in Latin prayer, and beneath it, other sounds, whispered conversations in Spanish, footsteps on stone floors that no longer existed, the creak of wooden doors that had rotted away centuries ago. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my tent with my camera running on night vision mode, pointed at the chapel, documenting hours of footage that showed nothing but empty ruins and shadows that moved against the wind direction. But the audio picked up everything. The singing, the prayers, the whispers, the footsteps. Sounds with no visible source, echoing through a place that should have been silent. By dawn, I was exhausted but determined to find a rational explanation. I spent day 2 doing acoustic analysis, looking for cavities in the walls that might channel wind into sound, checking for underground spaces that could create echo effects. I found something else instead, a sealed room. One of the side chambers had a wall that was clearly built later than the rest, different adobe mixture, different construction technique. Someone had deliberately walled off one of the rooms. It took me most of the afternoon to carefully remove enough bricks to create an opening I could squeeze through. What I found inside made my blood run cold. The room was a chapel within the chapel, a small private worship space, maybe 10 feet square. The walls were covered in writing, scratched into the adobe with fingernails or crude tools. Hundreds of words in Spanish, Latin, and what looked like indigenous languages I couldn't identify. The floor was stained dark brown in patterns that suggested dried blood, and in the center of the room was a stone altar with iron chains embedded in it, the kind used for restraining prisoners. I started photographing everything, documenting the text, trying to translate what I could read. Most of it was religious in nature, prayers, Bible verses, appeals to various saints, but some of it was darker, confessions of sins that went beyond normal Catholic doctrine, descriptions of rituals that sounded more like torture than worship, and repeated over and over in different hands the same phrase in Spanish, "Las oraciones no suben, van abajo." The prayers don't rise, they go down. The writing told a story I could piece together from fragments. The mission had been established in 1751, meant to convert the local Tohono O'odham and Apache populations. But the priests who ran it weren't interested in conversion. They were interested in extraction. They believed that suffering created powerful prayers, that torment could open channels to divine power. They'd used the sealed room to intensify the prayers of their converts through torture, believing the screams and pleas of the suffering would reach heaven more effectively than ordinary worship. What they'd actually done was something else entirely. The writing from the later years showed increasing paranoia and madness. The priests described the walls drinking the prayers, the ground beneath the chapel hungering for more. They wrote about shadows that moved with intelligence, about hearing their own voices praying back to them from the walls, about the dead rising from the cemetery to attend services. The final entry, dated 1753, was almost illegible. "We have fed it too much. It won't let us leave. It wants all the prayers, all the pain, all the souls. God has abandoned this place. Something else listens here now." The mission had been abandoned in 1753. Official records said it was due to Apache raids, but there were no records of attacks, no records of the priests relocating to other missions. They'd just disappeared, and the church had apparently decided to pretend the place had never existed. I should have left then, should have documented what I'd found, sealed the room back up, and gone straight to my thesis advisor. But I needed more evidence, more photos, more documentation. I spent that second night in the sealed room, camera recording, taking detailed photographs of every inch of text-covered wall. And that's when I realized the mistake. The prayers I'd been hearing weren't recordings, weren't echoes from the past. They were happening in real time, and they were coming from the walls themselves. The adobe bricks were praying, each one containing the compressed suffering of someone who died here, their final prayers and screams pressed into the clay like fossils. And my presence, my attention, my documentation, it was waking them up. Around midnight, the room filled with voices. Dozens of them, hundreds maybe, all praying in different languages, all begging for deliverance, all screaming in torment. The walls began to sweat, actual moisture seeping from the adobe, running down in red-brown rivulets that looked and smelled like blood. The chains on the altar rattled and pulled tight, straining against nothing, or against something I couldn't see. I ran, left my camping gear, grabbed only my camera and car keys, and ran through the dark ruins toward where I'd parked. The entire mission complex was alive now, every wall praying, every room filled with sounds of suffering from centuries past. I could see them, or the impressions of them. Shadows burned into the walls, showing people in positions of torment, mouths open in eternal screams. I made it to my car and drove away fast, not stopping until I reached Tucson an hour later. When I reviewed my camera footage the next day, most of it was corrupted, digital noise, and distortion that made it unwatchable, but the audio was intact. Hours of prayers in dozens of voices, all overlapping, all begging to be heard. I filed a preliminary report with my thesis advisor, describing the sealed room and the writing I'd found, carefully leaving out the supernatural elements. The university sent a team to investigate 2 weeks later. They found the sealed room exactly as I'd described, documented the writing, took samples. But they didn't spend the night. They didn't hear the prayers. The mission is now designated as a significant archaeological site, and the university is working with indigenous communities to properly document and potentially preserve it. But I know the truth about what that place really is. It's not just ruins. It's a container, a vessel that's been storing centuries of suffering and prayer, feeding on the torment of people who died believing their pain would buy them salvation. I changed my thesis topic to something safer, pottery analysis, nothing that requires overnight fieldwork. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear them, those voices praying from the walls, asking for someone to listen, to witness, to remember. The mission is 40 miles away, but the prayers travel. They've been looking for an audience for almost 300 years, and I was foolish enough to give them one. And the worst part, the writing I found scratched into those walls. It's appearing elsewhere now. I've seen the same phrases carved into rocks near my apartment, written in dust on my car windows, scratched into the margins of my notebook when I'm not looking. Las oraciones no suben, van abajo. The prayers don't rise, they go down. And once you've heard them, once you've really listened to what those walls are saying, they never stop trying to tell you their stories. Never stop asking you to pray with them, to join your voice to the centuries of voices already pressed into the clay, waiting in the darkness for the walls to finally remember them back to life. Sometimes the most dangerous thing in the desert isn't the heat or the wildlife. It's finding something that was deliberately buried and realizing too late that some graves were never meant to be opened. When my metal detector started screaming over what I thought would be old coins near quartzsite, I had no idea I was about to unearth something that had been sealed underground for a reason, something that should have stayed buried forever. My name is Blakely, and I'm a full-time RVer and amateur treasure hunter. I've been living out of my 20-foot trailer for the past 3 years, traveling across the Southwest with my metal detector, searching for lost coins, old jewelry, historical artifacts, basically anything valuable that people have dropped or buried over the centuries. It's not glamorous work, and it doesn't make me rich, but I cover my gas and food costs by selling what I find online, and I love the freedom of the lifestyle. No boss, no schedule, just me and the desert and the thrill of discovery. I'd been camped outside quartzsite for 2 weeks in mid-October, working an area that had been a stagecoach stop in the 1870s. Quartzsite is famous among treasure hunters. The town hosts massive gem and mineral shows, and the surrounding desert is littered with remnants of Old West history. I'd found a few good items, some old bottles, a handful of square nails, a couple of mercury dimes. Nothing spectacular, but enough to keep me interested and cover my propane costs. On a Thursday afternoon, I was working a wash about 3 miles from my camp when my detector went crazy. Not the usual beep-beep of something small and shallow, but a sustained scream that indicated something large and deep, buried maybe 4 or 5 feet down. My heart rate kicked up. This was the kind of signal that could mean a buried cache, maybe a Wells Fargo strongbox or a prospector's stash. I marked the spot with a rock and went back to my trailer for proper digging equipment. I returned with a folding shovel, a pry bar, plenty of water, and my GoPro camera mounted on my chest to document the find. If this turned out to be historically significant, I'd need video evidence, and if it turned out to be valuable, I wanted proof for insurance and authentication purposes. I started digging in the late afternoon heat, which was stupid. I should have waited for cooler evening temperatures, but I was too excited to be patient. The soil was typical desert caliche, hard-packed and rocky, slow-going even with a good shovel. After about an hour, I was 3 feet down, and the signal was getting stronger. After 2 hours, I was 4.5 feet down, standing in a hole up to my chest, when my shovel hit something solid. Not rock. This was too smooth, too regular. I cleared away more dirt carefully and exposed what looked like metal. A large metal box, maybe 3 feet long and 2 feet wide, made of iron that was heavily rusted but still intact. My hands were shaking as I cleared more dirt away from the edges. This was it. This was the big find every treasure hunter dreams about. The box had no visible lock, just a heavy lid that seemed to be sealed with some kind of ancient wax or tar around the edges. Weird choice for a strong box. Usually they were secured with padlocks or combination locks, not sealed shut. But maybe whoever buried this was more concerned with keeping moisture out than with being able to open it again easily. I used my pry bar to break the seal, and immediately I knew something was wrong. The smell that came out of that box wasn't the musty odor of old paper or the metallic scent of coins. It was organic, rotten, like meat that had been decaying in the desert heat. My stomach lurched, and I almost vomited right there in the hole, but I'd come this far. I used my phone's flashlight to look inside the box, and what I saw made no sense. The box was full of bones. Not old bones, not the brown or gray color of archaeological remains. These were white, almost bleach-looking, and they were arranged in a pattern. Dozens of small bones, finger bones maybe, or toe bones, laid out in concentric circles. In the center was a larger bone, maybe a femur, carved with symbols I didn't recognize. And wrapped around everything was a necklace made of what looked like human teeth. I'm not an archaeologist, but I know enough to recognize that this wasn't a normal burial. This was something ceremonial, something intentional and specific, and it definitely wasn't something I should be disturbing without proper authorities present. I decided to photograph everything, reseal the box, mark the GPS coordinates, and report it to the Bureau of Land Management in the morning. I took maybe 20 photos with my phone before my battery died, which was weird because I'd charged it fully that morning and it had shown 87% when I started digging. I took out my GoPro to continue documenting, but it was dead too, despite having a fresh battery. Both my backup phone batteries were also completely drained. Every electronic device I had brought to the site was dead. The sun was setting fast, and I was standing in a 5-foot hole with a box full of ritual bones and no working lights. Time to get out and deal with this in the morning. I started to climb out of the hole when I heard it, a sound like wind moving through hollow spaces, except there was no wind. The air was completely still. The sound was coming from the box. From inside the sealed metal box, I heard breathing. Slow, deliberate breaths, like something waking up after a very long sleep. I scrambled out of that hole faster than I've ever moved, scraping my arms and legs on the rocky walls. And when I cleared the edge, I looked back down. The bones were moving. Not dramatically, not floating or rearranging themselves like some movie effect. Just small movements, subtle shifts, like something was testing how well the pieces fit together, remembering how to assemble itself into a functional form. The femur in the center rolled slightly. The teeth on the necklace clicked together rhythmically. The small bones began to gather, pulling toward each other like they were magnetized. I ran, left my shovel, my pry bar, my dead electronics, everything. I ran the 3 miles back to my trailer in the gathering darkness, my lungs burning, my legs cramping, pure terror pushing me forward. When I reached my camp, I locked myself in the trailer, pulled all the curtains, and sat there, shaking until dawn. At first light, I started packing. I was leaving Quartzsite, leaving Arizona entirely, getting as far from that wash as I could manage. But when I tried to start my truck, it was dead. Completely dead, same as my phones and camera. The battery was new. The truck had been running fine yesterday, but now it wouldn't even click when I turned the key. I walked to the nearest occupied RV, about a quarter-mile away, to ask for a jump start. The couple who answered their door took one look at me and stepped back. "What happened to you?" the woman asked. I looked down at my arms and saw what she was seeing. My skin was covered in symbols, the same symbols that had been carved into that femur. They weren't tattoos or drawn on. They were raised like brands, but I felt no pain. They'd appeared overnight while I slept. The couple wouldn't help me. They closed their door, and I heard them lock it. I tried 2 other RVs with the same result. People took one look at the marks on my skin and wanted nothing to do with me. Finally, an older man in a beat-up Class C motorhome agreed to give me a ride into town if I stayed outside his RV and didn't touch anything. He drove me to the Quartzsite Sheriff's substation, where I tried to explain what I'd found and what had happened. The deputy listened with increasing skepticism, especially when I showed him the marks on my arms. He said they looked like henna tattoos, suggested I was on drugs, and told me to move along. When I insisted about the burial site and gave him the GPS coordinates, he said he'd send someone to check it out, but I could tell he thought I was crazy or lying. I had no choice but to walk back to my trailer. It took 2 hours in the morning heat, and by the time I arrived, I found that my camp had been ransacked. Not by thieves, nothing was stolen, but everything I owned had been opened, unfolded, scattered. My clothes were laid out in patterns on the ground. My books were arranged in circles. My food was stacked in pyramids. And in the center of my trailer, on my bed, was a small pile of bones. The same white, bleached-looking bones from the box. They'd followed me. Or it had followed me. Whatever I'd released from that buried box had come to my camp and was making itself at home in my space, using my belongings to create its patterns, leaving its pieces where I'd see them. I left everything, grabbed my wallet from where it had been placed carefully on the dashboard, because whatever this thing was, it wasn't stealing, it was organizing, and I walked. I walked to the highway, and I hitchhiked. A trucker picked me up and drove me all the way to Phoenix, though he kept glancing at the marks on my arms and wouldn't talk much. That was 6 weeks ago. The marks haven't faded. They've spread. They're now on my chest, my back, climbing up my neck toward my face. Dermatologists can't explain them. They're not burns, not scars, not tattoos. They're something else, something that's changing my skin from the inside. And I've started finding bones in my hotel room, in my coat pockets, in my shoes. Small white bones that appear overnight, always arranged in patterns. Sometimes I wake up and realize I've been arranging them myself in my sleep, my hands moving on their own, placing the pieces in configurations that feel important, even though I don't understand them. I researched the area where I was digging, found old newspaper articles from 1889 about a bone witch who was killed by locals near what's now Quartzsite. They said she wore the dead, that she could take bones from graves and make them walk again. They caught her and burned her, but her followers scattered her remains and sealed them in iron boxes, buried in secret locations across the desert. The article said the boxes should never be opened, that the iron and the seals kept her pieces separated and powerless. I opened one of those boxes. I broke a seal that had held for over a century, and now she's putting herself back together, one piece at a time, using me as the anchor point. The marks on my skin aren't brands or symbols, they're instructions, a map showing where each bone needs to go. I'm becoming the framework for her resurrection, the skeleton she'll wear when she's finished collecting all her scattered pieces. I tried to go back to the site, to reseal the box, to bury it again, but I can't find it. Every time I get near Quartzsite, the marks burn and my body refuses to cooperate. She doesn't want me near the other boxes. She wants me out here, moving through the world, drawing her bones to me from wherever they're buried. Last night, I woke up to find myself digging in the dirt lot behind my hotel with my bare hands. When I came to my senses, I'd unearthed another small metal box, just like the first one. I didn't open it, but I didn't need to. I could hear the bones inside calling to the bones that are already gathering around me. Could feel them responding to the map that's growing across my skin. And I knew that eventually, whether I want to or not, I'll open that box too. And the next one. And the next one. Until she's whole again. Until the bone witch has collected all her pieces, and I'm nothing but the wire frame she used to pull herself back together. One buried box at a time. Most people think stargazing in the Arizona desert is peaceful, but what they don't tell you is that sometimes, when you're looking up at the stars through a telescope, you might notice something looking back down at you, and once it knows you've seen it, it starts getting closer with every night that passes. I'm an amateur astronomer who's been documenting the night sky from a remote observatory near Flagstaff for 6 months, and 3 weeks ago, I photographed something in orbit that isn't on any satellite tracking database, something that's been descending steadily ever since, something that will reach ground level in approximately 72 hours. My name is Amaya, and astronomy has been my passion since childhood. I'm a high school physics teacher in Flagstaff, but my real love is the night sky. 2 years ago, I bought a small property 40 miles outside the city. 10 acres of nothing but high desert scrubland at 7,000 feet elevation, far from light pollution, with clear dark skies that rival professional observatory sites. I spent a year building a small roll-off roof observatory, installing a serious telescope setup. A 14-inch Schmidt Cassegrain with computerized tracking and a CCD camera for astrophotography. Nothing professional grade, but far beyond casual hobbyist equipment. My routine is simple. Drive out to the property every Friday after school, spend the weekend photographing whatever targets I've planned, return to Flagstaff Sunday evening with memory cards full of data to process during the week. I'm working on a long-term project documenting variable stars, contributing observations to the American Association of Variable Star Observers. It's meticulous, repetitive work that requires patience and precision, exactly the kind of thing that appeals to my methodical nature. 3 weeks ago, on a Friday night in late October, I was setting up for a standard observing session. Clear skies, no moon, perfect conditions. I'd planned to photograph several Cepheid variables in Cassiopeia, but while I was calibrating the telescope's pointing accuracy using bright reference stars, I noticed something odd. There was a star in my field of view that shouldn't have been there. Not according to my star charts, not according to the planetarium software that controlled my telescope mount. I thought it might be a satellite. The sky is full of them now. Starlink satellites, weather satellites, military reconnaissance birds. They show up in astrophotos as streaks or dots that move against the fixed stars. But this object wasn't moving like a satellite. It was stationary relative to the background stars, which meant it was either incredibly far away or in a very unusual orbit. I took several exposures with different exposure times, then spent an hour measuring the object's position precisely, checking it against every catalog and database I had access to. Nothing matched. No known satellite, no asteroid, no comet, no star. It was magnitude 12, which meant it was faint, invisible to the naked eye, only visible through a telescope. And it had a strange appearance in my images, perfectly circular, with a faint luminous halo that pulsed slightly between exposures, like it was breathing. I reported it through the proper channels, the Minor Planet Center, which tracks asteroids and unusual objects. I posted about it on amateur astronomy forums. And then I did what any curious astronomer would do. I started monitoring it obsessively, photographing it every clear night to track any changes in position or brightness. Over the first week, I noticed it was getting brighter. Not dramatically, but measurably, from magnitude 12 to magnitude 11.5, which meant it was either growing more luminous or getting closer. I calculated its orbit based on positional measurements and realized with growing unease that it wasn't following any normal orbital mechanics. It was descending, steadily, predictably, spiraling down toward Earth in a controlled descent that looked more like a spacecraft making a landing approach than any natural celestial object. By week 2, it was magnitude 10 and visible in binoculars if you knew exactly where to look. The pulsing in my images was more pronounced, and I'd started to see structure. The object wasn't spherical, it was faceted, angular. The images were never quite sharp enough to resolve details, but it definitely had geometry to it, artificial-looking geometry. I reached out to professional astronomers at Lowell Observatory in Flagstaff. They were polite but dismissive. Probably a satellite, they said, or an optical artifact in my camera, nothing to be concerned about. When I insisted and sent them my data, they stopped responding to my emails. That silence worried me more than if they'd told me I was crazy. By the start of week 3, the object was magnitude 8, easily visible in binoculars, starting to show up on the edge of naked eye visibility from dark sites, and I wasn't the only one seeing it anymore. Other amateur astronomers started posting about it online, asking what it was, sharing photos that matched mine. The object was now noticeably structured, elongated, with what looked like protrusions, or appendages extending from a central body. Someone posted an image showing what they claimed was movement, the appendages rotating or articulating. Then the posts started disappearing. Astronomy forums deleted threads about the object. YouTube videos analyzing it were taken down. My emails to other observers bounced back or went unanswered. Within 72 hours, all online discussion of the object had been scrubbed. I checked my own website where I'd posted my images. They were gone, replaced with a polite message saying the content had been removed at the request of the Department of Defense. That's when I got scared. Not because of what the object might be, but because someone with power and resources was actively suppressing information about it. Whatever this thing was, somebody official knew about it and wanted to keep it quiet. I kept observing, but I stopped posting anything online. I kept my images on encrypted drives, made backup copies, sent data to trusted friends with instructions to release it if anything happened to me. And I watched the object continue its steady descent, getting brighter every night, growing larger, showing more detail. Last Friday night, 3 weeks after my initial detection, I drove out to my observatory for what I thought would be another documentation session. The object was now magnitude 6, clearly visible to the naked eye as a star that didn't belong in the familiar constellations. I could see it without the telescope, a reddish point of light that pulsed with that same breathing rhythm, but much more obvious now. I set up my equipment and began my planned observations. But as I centered the object in my telescope's field of view, I realized something had changed. The object wasn't just descending anymore. It was spreading. The central body had extended multiple long appendages. I counted 8, arranged symmetrically, each one hundreds of miles long based on my measurements. And at the end of each appendage was something that looked disturbingly organic, like a flower or a hand or something between the two. I took hundreds of images over the next 6 hours as the object slowly rotated against the stars. And with each image, I became more certain that I was looking at something alive. The appendages moved with purpose, the central body expanded and contracted, and in my highest resolution images, I could see surface details that looked less like machinery and more like tissue, membrane. I don't have words for what I was seeing. Around 3 a.m., my telescope's tracking suddenly stopped working. The motor made grinding noises and then went silent. I checked the connections, the power supply, everything looked fine, but the mount was completely dead. My laptop, the one running the telescope control software, started displaying errors, files corrupting, system instabilities. My phone, which I'd been using to check satellite predictions and weather, went dark despite showing 60% battery a minute earlier. The object was now directly overhead. I could see it without instruments, a red star that pulsed and seemed to grow brighter as I watched. And beneath it, beneath the visible object, I could see something else. A shadow, maybe, or a distortion in the stars behind it, as if the object was casting some kind of effect that extended far beyond its visible form. I heard my car alarm going off 50 yards away where I'd parked. Then it stopped. Then my observatory's LED lights, which run on batteries, flickered and died. Every electronic device I had was failing one by one, in order of proximity to the telescope that was still pointing at the object overhead. I did the only rational thing I could think of. I ran to my car and tried to leave. The car was dead, completely dead. No dashboard lights, no response from the key fob, nothing. I was alone at my observatory, 40 miles from the nearest town, with no working electronics and something in the sky that was getting closer. I spent that night huddled in my observatory, watching through the open roof as the object slowly transitioned across the sky. I could see it clearly now without any instruments, not just the central body and its appendages, but smaller details. Lights that weren't reflected sunlight, moving patterns across its surface, geometric transformations that hurt to watch for too long, as if my brain couldn't properly process what my eyes were seeing. At dawn, when the sky began to lighten, the object faded from view, not because of the sun, but because it dimmed deliberately, as if it knew it was being watched and chose to hide in the daylight. And exactly when it disappeared, all my electronics came back online simultaneously. Car started, phone powered up, telescope mount reset itself, and returned to home position. I drove back to Flagstaff at illegal speeds and have been here ever since, checking my calculations obsessively. Based on 3 weeks of measurements, the object is descending at a constant rate. If it maintains that rate, and it has been perfectly consistent, it will reach ground level in 72 hours. Tomorrow night at approximately 11:47 p.m., something that's been in orbit above us, something that's been getting steadily closer, something that can kill electronics at will, and that someone powerful doesn't want us talking about, will touch down somewhere in Arizona. I don't know what it is. Alien? Satellite? Weapon? Something that's been up there for longer than we've been watching, finally deciding to come down. I only know that I've documented its entire descent, that I have proof of its existence and its capabilities, and that in 3 days we're going to find out what happens when something that large and that unknown makes contact with Earth. I've sent copies of all my data to multiple locations, given instructions for its release if I disappear. I've written down everything I know, everything I've observed, because amateur astronomers like me might be the only ones who'll tell the truth about this. The professionals have been silenced, the government is covering it up, and in 72 hours, whatever's been descending from the sky is going to land. And I'm going to be there, at my observatory, with my telescope pointed at the landing zone, documenting whatever happens next. Because that's what astronomers do. We watch the sky, we record what we see, we tell the truth about what's out there, even when what's out there is coming down, even when someone doesn't want us to know, even when everything we thought we understood about the universe gets rewritten by something 8-armed and pulsing and impossibly alien descending from orbit with purpose and intelligence and 72 hours until impact. They tell you to stay on marked trails when hiking, but nobody explains why some trails have markers that change position overnight, or why following them leads you to places that weren't there the day before. When I accepted a job as a trail maintenance worker for the Coconino National Forest, I thought the biggest danger would be rattlesnakes or heat exhaustion. I never imagined I'd be responsible for destroying paths that appear spontaneously, paths that lead hikers somewhere they can never return from. My name is Adalynn, and I've worked trail maintenance for the U.S. Forest Service for 8 months now. It's physical work, clearing brush, repairing erosion damage, replacing worn trail markers, removing hazards, but it pays decent, and I love being outdoors. My assigned territory covers about 40 square miles of forest near Sedona, including some of the most popular hiking trails in Arizona. I work alone most days, which suits me fine. Just me, my truck full of equipment, and miles of beautiful red rock country. The training was straightforward. Maintain existing trails, report any damage or hazards, keep hikers safe and on designated paths. Standard stuff. But during my orientation, my supervisor, a grizzled guy named Walter, who'd been with the Forest Service for 30 years, pulled me aside for what he called the real training. He took me to a storage shed behind the ranger station and showed me a separate set of equipment that wasn't on any official inventory. Heavy-duty pruning shears, a machete, orange spray paint, and a laminated map with red X marks scattered across my territory. Sometimes you'll find trails that aren't on the official maps, Walter said, his voice low even though we were alone. Paths that just appear, usually overnight. They'll look legitimate, packed dirt, sometimes even cairns or markers that look official. Your job is to destroy them immediately. Cut down the cairns, spray paint over any markers, block the trail entrance with brush and deadfall, make it impossible for hikers to follow them. I thought he was joking at first, or testing me somehow, but his expression was dead serious. "What kind of trails are we talking about?" I asked. "The kind that lead somewhere else," he said. "Somewhere that looks like our forest but isn't. Somewhere hikers go and don't come back from. Or if they do come back, they're wrong, different, changed, broken in ways that can't be fixed. I've been doing this job for 3 decades, and I've seen it happen. We lose 2, maybe 3 hikers a year to those paths. Officially, they're listed as missing, presumed dead from exposure or falls. But I know better. They followed the wrong trails." He showed me incident reports going back years. Hikers who vanished from well-traveled areas with no explanation. Search parties that found nothing. Families who never got closure. And scattered through the reports were notes in Walter's handwriting. "False trail found and destroyed, 0.3 miles from disappearance point," or "cairn line leading off established path, markers removed." "How do you know which trails are wrong?" I asked, trying to process what he was telling me. "You'll know," he said. "They feel wrong. The vegetation around them is off. Too lush or too dead, colors that don't match the season. The trail surface is too perfect, or the markers are placed in patterns that don't follow Forest Service standards. And if you stand at the entrance and look down the path, sometimes you'll see things in the distance that shouldn't be there. Structures, landmarks that don't exist on any map. Trust your gut. If a trail feels wrong, it probably is." For my first 3 months, I thought Walter was either paranoid or messing with me. I maintained trails, replaced markers, cleared brush, and never saw anything unusual. Then, in early November, I found my first false trail. I was working a section of the Hangover Trail, repairing some steps that had eroded after monsoon rains, when I noticed a path branching off that wasn't on my map. It was well defined, about 3 feet wide, with a clear line of cairns leading into a side canyon. The cairns looked professional, carefully stacked, stable, but something about them bothered me. They were too evenly spaced, too identical in size, and the path surface was strange, almost too smooth, like it had been groomed. I walked to the entrance and looked down the trail. About 100 yards ahead, where the canyon curved out of sight, I could see what looked like stone ruins, walls and structures that resembled ancient Sinagua cliff dwellings. But I knew this canyon. I'd hiked it twice during my training period. There were no ruins here, nothing but scrub oak and manzanita. I felt my skin prickling, that instinctive warning that something was very wrong. I pulled out the laminated map Walter had given me and marked the location, then got to work destroying the trail. I kicked down every cairn, dragged dead branches across the path entrance, spray-painted orange X's over the worn areas to discourage hikers. It took 2 hours to make the trail impassable. That night, I called Walter and reported what I'd found. He was quiet for a long moment, then said, "Good work. Keep monitoring that area. Sometimes they come back." He was right. 2 days later, the trail had returned. Same location, same cairns rebuilt, same too smooth path surface. The branches I'd dragged across were neatly moved aside, stacked parallel to the trail, like someone had cleared them deliberately. I destroyed it again, more thoroughly this time, and reported it. Walter told me to check it daily. For 2 weeks, the trail reappeared every morning. I'd destroy it, and the next day it would be back, sometimes in slightly different configurations, but always leading toward those impossible ruins in the canyon. On the 15th day, I arrived at dawn to find fresh footprints on the trail, boot prints, hiking boots, leading down the path toward the ruins. Someone had followed it during the night. I radioed Walter immediately. He told me not to follow, to destroy the trail as usual and file a missing persons report if anyone was reported overdue. But I couldn't just leave. Someone was down there, possibly lost, definitely in danger. I took my radio, my first aid kit, and my can of spray paint, and I followed the footprints. The trail led deeper into the canyon than should have been physically possible. I'd hiked this area multiple times. It was a box canyon, ending in a cliff face after maybe half a mile, But I walked for over a mile, and the canyon kept going, the walls getting higher, the vegetation changing from high desert scrub to plants I didn't recognize. The air felt different, thicker, and the light had a strange quality, like I was seeing through tinted glass. The ruins appeared gradually. First, just a few wall segments, then more substantial structures, then an entire complex of cliff dwellings that definitely, absolutely should not exist. They looked ancient, but too well preserved. Stone walls standing straight and solid, wooden roof beams that hadn't rotted despite what should have been centuries of exposure. And there were people, not hikers. People dressed in what looked like historical clothing from different eras. A woman in a 1950s-style dress. A man in what might have been 1920s hiking clothes. A teenage girl in modern athletic wear that looked recent. They were wandering through the ruins, moving slowly. And when I called out to them, they didn't respond. They moved like sleepwalkers, touching the walls, examining the structures, occasionally looking up at the sky with expressions of confusion. I approached the girl. She looked most recent, her clothes still relatively clean. "Hey, are you okay? Do you need help?" She turned to look at me, and I saw that her eyes were wrong. Not the color or the shape, but the way she looked at me. No recognition, no awareness, like she was looking through me at something else entirely. "The trail brought me here," she said in a flat, distant voice. "It shows you places. Real places. Places that exist behind the world you know. Once you see them, once you walk far enough, you can't find your way back. The path only goes forward." I grabbed her arm, tried to pull her back toward where I'd entered, but she resisted with surprising strength. "You can leave," she said. "You haven't stayed long enough yet. The place hasn't learned your shape. But if you stay much longer, if you go deeper, you'll be like us. Part of the real forest, the one that exists underneath the one people think they're hiking in." I ran, sprayed orange X's on trees as I went to mark my path back, and I ran until the canyon walls started looking normal again, until the vegetation matched what I recognized, until I could hear traffic from the highway in the distance. When I finally stopped, gasping and shaking, I was back on the hangover trail at the point where the false path had branched off. The path was gone, not destroyed, just absent, like it had never existed. I reported everything to Walter. He listened without interrupting, then told me something that made my blood run cold. "That girl you saw, describe her." I did, and he pulled up a file on his computer. "Missing hiker reported 3 months ago, last seen on the hangover trail. Her name was Sarah Chen, age 17, experienced hiker. No trace ever found." "They're still alive?" I asked, horrified. "They're trapped there?" "They're somewhere," Walter said. "Somewhere that looks like our forest but operates on different rules. The false trails are connection points, doorways maybe. We don't know what creates them or why. We just know that destroying them quickly before hikers find them is the only way to prevent more disappearances." Since that day, I've found and destroyed 17 false trails in my territory. They appear more frequently in certain areas, especially near ancient sites or places with geological anomalies. I work faster now, checking my high-risk zones daily, sometimes twice daily. I've gotten good at spotting the signs, the too perfect cairns, the vegetation inconsistencies, that feeling of wrongness that makes the hair on your neck stand up. Last week, I found a false trail that had been followed recently, multiple sets of footprints, including what looked like a family with small children. I destroyed the trail and reported it, but I know they're gone. Somewhere in that other forest, the one that exists behind ours, a family's wandering through impossible ruins, slowly forgetting how to find their way home, becoming permanent residents of a place that shouldn't exist. I still love my job, but it's different now. Every trail I maintain, every marker I replace, I'm aware that I'm fighting against something that wants people to wander off the official paths. Something that creates inviting trails leading to beautiful, impossible places. Something that collects hikers the way we might collect butterflies, preserving them in a world that looks like ours but isn't, keeping them forever in a forest with no exit. So when you're hiking in Arizona, or anywhere really, stay on the marked trails. And if you see a path that looks perfect, too perfect, with cairns that seem too carefully placed, or vegetation that doesn't quite match, turn around. Report it to the rangers if you can. But whatever you do, don't follow it to see where it goes. Because I've seen where it goes, and I've seen the people who can't come back, and I promise you that no view, no scenic overlook, no shortcut is worth becoming a permanent resident of the forest that exists underneath the one you think you're exploring. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of terror from the Arizona wilderness and beyond, please subscribe to my YouTube channel, Haunted Fears. I share true horror stories, unexplained phenomena, and terrifying encounters that will make you think twice before your next outdoor adventure. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that will keep you up at night. Thank you for listening, and remember, not all trails lead home.